Hi everyone, I'm here in Jamie's office, and what you guys may not know is that we often talk about literature. This is part of our new and exciting series, Duco, What Are You Teaching This Week? And Jamie will function here as the well-informed student who is interested in in what we actually do in this building. So Jamie, I'm this week I'm teaching the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas by Gertrude Stein.
And who's she?
Well, see, this is always the problem I have with Jamie. But Gertrude Stein was an American, born in, as she always proudly says, Allegheny, Pennsylvania, but she actually doesn't remember anything. She moved to San Francisco, but became one of the kind of most famous art collectors and art patrons in Paris during the early 1920s. She features, there's a fictional portrait of her in Woody Allen's Midnight in Paris. It's really hilarious. I've actually put it on the mold site. And she's also been credited as really working hard with changing the boundaries of English literature. An amazing woman, vibrant. She went over to Paris with her brother and basically discovered Picasso, Cézanne, Matisse, bought them all, put them in her nice little salon on Rue de Fleur 23, and during the war drove an ambulance that she bought herself, had brought over from America. Extraordinarily kind of vibrant woman. And her book is supposedly an autobiography.
So why should I care about her book?
Well, first of all, the book is kind of strange, right? So because it's not called the autobiography of Gertrude Stein, it's called the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas.
Who's Alice B. Toklas?
Alice B. Toklas is Gertrude Stein's life partner. So they lived together and they had a kind of a curious husband and wife relationship where Alice was the wife who, for example, when she had her discussions with all these famous artists, she had to entertain the wives. So one of the kind of fun titles that they tried to give for this book was Wives of Geniuses I've Sat With. So, but there are some, so it's very curious because when you read it, it's very obviously kind of Gertrude Stein's autobiography, but it's written in the third person.
Right.
And there's also a certain, so not only kind of footballers talk about themselves in the third person, yeah, but Gertrude Stein seems to do it. So
Gertrude Stein is writing the book about Alice B. Toklas, but it's about Gertrude.
Basically, yes.
Right.
And so basically, Alice types the manuscript. So, the final page, you've got this thing, basically said, because Gertrude Stein always said to Alice B. Toklas, you should write an autobiography. And then she says, about 3 weeks ago, Gertrude Stein said, it does not look to me as if you were ever going to write that autobiography. You know what I'm going to do. I am going to write it for you. I am going to write it as simple as devoted the autobiography of Robinson Crusoe, and she has, and this is it. So that's her autobiography, and she says some wonderful sentences. She's a very kind of this should speak for itself. She says, then I met Gertrude Stein. I was impressed by the coral brooch she wore and by her voice. I may say that only 3 times in my life have I met a genius, and each time a bell within me rang, and I was not mistaken. And I may say that in each case it was before there was my general recognition of the quality of the genius in them. The 3 geniuses of whom I wish to speak are Gertrude Stein, Pablo Picasso, and Alfred Whitehead.
This is pretty pompous, isn't it?
You could say that there is a lot of kind of Gertrude Stein, and within the autobiography as well, that basically proclaims her as the leader of this whole avant-garde movement, that everything she says and does influences others. So there is definitely a kind of a persona and myth-making element to this.
Right.
So for example, with the Stein collection, her brother was extremely important in all of this. But he left to go to Florence, but the older brother and his wife Sarah, she actually also had a salon not very far from where Gertrude was, and it was more of a Stein kind of family thing than just Gertrude Stein. But there's no doubt she was important, and she was on the website. You, for example, see the portrait that Picasso did of her, with the long sittings. It's a fascinating portrait, and there are more of these portraits, and a lot of people have acknowledged. So Hemingway, for example, he dedicated The Sun Also Rises to her, about the notion of the lost generation.
She must have been a pretty big deal if Picasso painted her. So it's not me writing a book about me. She's a bit.
There's also, by the time that Picasso did this, he was actually not well known. So this is the time when she's writing, and when she's sitting for these paintings, when they are buying these Cézannes, the Matisse, the Braque, and all these, now invaluable paintings. They also bought them for very little money, and in some way they put them on the map. So they bought them for very little money. So you now have, so they had these weekly salons that she talks about a lot in the book, where all these artists gathered, where people who were interested in seeing these paintings would come from all over the world. And she would, in a way, advertise these paintings, and they became rather invaluable. So there's, for example, the Stein collection has been bought up, was divided between Leo and her. But so there is some truth to the whole notion of that she was important as a kind of a patron and a collector of the art that brought these authors out. Paris was so much kind of the center of the art movement at this time.
Well, with a School of English, why do we care about Paris? What?
It's a different world, and it's, for example, incredibly interesting to compare, the text that we did last week with Mrs. Dalloway, to which you haven't read, but Mrs. Dalloway is all set in London. Her life seems to be mapped out to her, and basically, one of the kind of tenets seems to be that life has just passed her by at 52. Kind of life is over, and she keeps thinking about the decisions that have influenced the kind of the pattern of her life. Here is a woman who moves from from the U.S. within the U.S. has been educated in Vienna, during her childhood years, speaks multiple languages, and just moves around. This is a very different kind of movement of character than something as enclosed almost as the world of Mrs. Dalloway. So Paris becomes this kind of symbol for an almost new global art world, where the national kind of ideas about art are becoming much more globalized. There are tremendous movements. One of the things about the book is that so much seems to be happening. There's always a new style, there's always a new change. And if you compare this to some of the other texts we've done, where everything is kind of almost dead, there's no agency, there's no control. Here, it is all about having control, even if it is a bit kind of ironic in terms of how important she makes herself sound. Yeah. But there's a huge kind of element to the power she evokes in Paris and all the people that are there. I mean, if the book consists of a lot of name dropping and all of that, but it's really interesting. Ask me something about the style of the book.
What's the style of the book?
When you read it,
Can I have a flick through
yeah,
it?
you can have a flick through. You can have a flick through. When you read it, the language seems to be extraordinarily surfacey, and you think, what is this about? The style, and she talks about this in several passages, is about applying some of the theories of painting actually and applying them to styles of writing.
Yeah.
Which kind of upset a lot of the editors that she sends manuscripts to, and where people have arguments about her kind of writing style. But it's, for example, there's a lack of punctuation, there's a masses of repetition. A famous phrase that you may have heard from Stein is, a rose is a rose is a rose is a rose. So I don't know whether you've heard that.
Yeah.
But the whole kind of notion about the repetition of language, and each time you use a word, while it is a repetition, it's already influenced, it changes its meaning because of what has come before. So a repetition can actually not exist kind of within time and becomes this. But so annoyingly in literature, what you get is the literal repetition of phrases. So you think, I've already read this, but it becomes a kind of a literal repetition. There's quite a bit of this kind of experimentation going on within the text. She does, for example, these snippets of portraits of people. So it's like portrait painting.
Right.
So she, Eliot is like characterized as, having an argument about a comma. So he becomes kind of, he's presented as this kind of fussy old man who doesn't know what's going on. So there's a lot of these kind of stylistic innovations that she does. One of the things that might help with reading the book is she writes, for example, about Picasso and some of the others, that the first paintings in a new style are always deemed to be ugly. People literally want to scratch off the paint.
I've been at the Picasso Museum. They are ugly. They painted the same thing about 75 times as well.
But as you see, repetition doesn't exist. You try to change the form, you play with the form.
You couldn't paint.
Well, one of the interesting things is to look at in terms of the paintings of Gertrude Stein here. So the Gertrude Stein painting, she sat about 90 times for him.
Right.
And he had painted her, but then he was unhappy with her face. So he basically erased the face of her portrait, and a few years later, he, without her sitting for it, repainted it, and it actually now looks a little bit like a mask. So it's an extraordinary kind of strangeness of Gertrude Stein with this kind of mask. And people would say, for example, but Gertrude Stein doesn't look like the painting. And then he replied, she will.
Yeah.
It's that kind of idea about, but what he said, for example, the first time it looks ugly, but because of the new methodologies, others can then come and make it beautiful. So apply the same principle and make it beautiful. Does that sound convincing to you or not? So that, for example, like pop art and everything else, that one thing follows another, and for the first one to break the kind of plane, you always get this kind of almost upset.
Yeah.
And then it becomes, a few years later, it is almost commercialized. So, for example, the phrase "a rose is a rose is a rose" you can get on a cup now.
Yeah. My cup has Darth Vader on it.
Well, can't argue with that. But so that's another. You see, we go to the mask.
Yeah.
Now, the masking is really interesting in this book, I think, because if you look at her life,
there's no pictures in here.
There's no pictures in there, but there's pictures in this one. See, this is the portrait. So this is black and white. There's a lot better one, but this is the portrait. See the kind of mask-like face?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Not my type.
Not your type, no. But one of the things that's important to kind of think about when reading the book is the extraordinary energy and trauma that must have been around her. So, for example, she comes from a very wealthy family. Her father basically owned a cable car company in San Francisco. It's new money. And it allows her this freedom that, for example, Virginia Woolf, who writes, when a woman has to write, she has to have a space of her own and like £500. Well, Gertrude Stein had a whole salon and a whole house and everything to help her. So she wasn't restricted by this. And it might also be the new kind of American woman coming over, traveling, breaking boundaries. But for example, her partnership with Alice B. Toklas, that will certainly have caused a lot of upheaval. She was one of the first women to go to the Johns Hopkins Medical School. She had a paper published with William James, who's like one of the most important philosophers within America about in terms of pragmatism. She drove this ambulance during World War I, learned how to drive, meeting generals. Extraordinary kind of life when you think about it.
Yeah.
But it's not written in this way. It's written as if everything just happens and it's normal and it's almost a bit of a laugh. Whereas a lot must have happened. So for example, she was very close with her brother, and you get the breakup in the book. You get that in a little paragraph saying, oh, Leo went to Florence and we divided the paintings. But no emotion, nothing. So she writes, for example, about the relationship between the exterior and the interior and how emotion should be completely left out of it.
Yeah.
Am
I think I might need to know a bit more about it.
Are you interested enough to start kind of looking at it?
I'll have a look.
All right. All right.
Yeah.
There's a lot more, and we will talk a lot more about it in the seminars, obviously.
Have you got stuff in the mall site?
There's a lot of stuff on the mall site. So I've even got a clip from Midnight in Paris. There's a little bit of music, etc., etc., etc.
Okay, I'll give it a go.
Okay. There's also the war.
Don't mention the war.
Yeah, well, exactly. There is World War II, even though she comes from a German Jewish family, there are a lot of questions around Gertrude Stein's kind of survival within in World War II. This is not in the autobiography because that was published beforehand. This is
there is a chapter called The War.
Yeah, but that's World War One.
Okay.
And one of the things that's interesting about World War One and the way she writes it is that it makes her convinced. She says things like, America is the oldest country in the world. These Americans are coming over. And she says it's because America was the first country to enter the 20th century with its kind of new industrialization and its openness, its willingness to embrace difference as opposed to kind of the old type in room. So I mean, you can almost see her as a kind of a type of new woman who completely doesn't want to be labeled as such. She says, for example, in the book that when she flunks out or drops out, either one, out of medical school, that the cause of women is not her business, even though her life seems to suggest kind of otherwise, how challenging it all must have been for her. But you don't get anything about that in the book. But World War II is kind of and is a different kind of story, and so people can look that up. I've put some stuff on there. But she stayed in France, didn't escape, and one of the people she translated was a major kind of Nazi collaborator.
Right.
So
is there a part two?
She has written The Making of Americans, which is a 1,000-page book, which is basically unreadable. So this is one of her only books that appeals to more of a general audience because it resists the extraordinary experimentation that she does in some of her other novels. She's written 3 lives, which are 3 portraits of American women. And Malengtha is usually the one that's anthologized most in American literature anthologies. A very interesting kind of story about an African American woman So she's broken so much ground, and I think this book is shows a little bit of that energy and difference that is important during this period. It's kind of groundbreaking stuff.
Okay.
Have a go, Jamie.
I'll have a go. Yeah.
We'll see how this pans out with our time with our next readings. What are we reading next week?
We'll find out next week.